In January 2026, something happened in West Virginia that didn't trend on YouTube. It didn't explode across comment sections. It didn't come with a viral thumbnail. But it may end up mattering more than any of that. West Virginia Senate Bill 54 was introduced on January 14, 2026, and passed out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. On its surface, it appears straightforward. It strengthens state law to better protect incapacitated adults from abuse and neglect. But timing is everything. Because this bill arrives at the exact moment 3 nonverbal members of the Whittaker family are now in state care, removed from their home and odd in place within the very system this law addresses. So the question becomes unavoidable. Is this coincidence or influence? Let's slow down and examine what Senate Bill 54 actually does. The bill amends West Virginia Code to clarify and strengthen definitions surrounding abuse and neglect of incapacitated adults. More specifically, it introduces a legal definition of gross neglect, describing it as reckless or intentional conduct by a caregiver that demonstrates disregard for the health and safety of a vulnerable adult. That may sound like legal fine print. It's not. Legal definitions determine what can be prosecuted. They determine what crosses the threshold from mistake to crime. They determine whether facilities and caregivers can be held criminally accountable. When a law sharpens the definition of gross neglect, it's not symbolic. It changes the standard. And that matters in a state where vulnerable adults are frequently placed into long-term care facilities, group homes, or supervised environments. Now place that against the backdrop of what has unfolded in Raleigh County. Over the past year, the Whittaker family situation escalated dramatically. 3 members, all with significant developmental challenges, were removed under Adult Protective Services Authority. They are no longer living on the porch that became so widely recognized. They are in the system. And once someone enters that system, the promise is safety. The promise is oversight. The promise is better care. But here's where this bill becomes interesting. You don't strengthen definitions of gross neglect unless there is concern that existing definitions were insufficient. You don't push accountability language unless someone believes accountability has gaps. At nearly the same time this bill was introduced, Raleigh County's judicial system was facing scrutiny. A family court judge stepped down following conduct violations. Public discussions around oversight, corruption, and treatment of vulnerable individuals had already surfaced. This wasn't happening in isolation. There was attention. There was controversy. There were questions. And legislators respond to pressure. Not always directly. Not always publicly. But systems react when scrutiny increases. Now, let's be clear. There is no official statement connecting Senate Bill 54 directly to the Whittaker case. No legislator has stood up and said, this is because of them. But legislative reform rarely announces its inspirations. Sometimes it's one case. Sometimes it's several. Sometimes it's years of quiet concerns that suddenly gain momentum when visibility rises. And the Whittakers brought visibility. Their situation moved from private poverty to public oversight, from a porch in odd to national discussion, from family care to state care. That transition carries weight, because once the state assumes responsibility for incapacitated adults, the standard of care becomes not just personal, but institutional. And institutional systems require legal frameworks. Let's examine what this bill signals beyond its text. First, it signals recognition that incapacitated adults are uniquely vulnerable. Second, it signals that reckless caregiver behavior, even if unintentional, can have criminal consequences. Third, it signals that oversight inside facilities matters just as much as oversight outside them. That third point is critical. Much of the early online debate surrounding the Whittakers focused on removal being inherently positive. They're in better care. They're safer now. They're protected. But Senate Bill 54 acknowledges a harder truth. Safety is not automatic just because someone is institutionalized. Care facilities are run by people. People make mistakes. And in rare cases, people act recklessly. Strengthening legal definitions suggests the state wants stronger tools to intervene when that happens. Now consider the timing again. January 2026. 3 Whittakers already under state supervision. Public awareness heightened. Judicial scrutiny ongoing in Raleigh County. And into that environment, Senate Bill 54 moves forward. Coincidence? Possibly. Legislation can take months or years of drafting before introduction. But influence doesn't require direct causation. Public attention accelerates political will. When voters are watching, when media is watching, when communities are discussing vulnerable adults in courtrooms and facilities, lawmakers take notice. Even if the Whittakers were not the sole catalyst, they may have contributed to an atmosphere where such reforms gained urgency. Now let's talk about impact. If Senate Bill 54 becomes fully enacted law, it could affect every facility, group home, and caregiver responsible for incapacitated adults in West Virginia. It increases liability. It sharpens standards. It places a clearer spotlight on reckless disregard for patient safety. For individuals like the 3 Whittakers currently in care, that's not theoretical. That's daily life. If the law works as intended, it ensures stronger oversight, clearer accountability, criminal consequences when standards are breached. And that matters long-term. Because unlike temporary legal cases or viral attention, institutional placement can last years, possibly indefinitely. Now let's address another layer. Some have speculated that this bill may also reflect broader concerns within Raleigh County's family court system. Recent developments involving judicial conduct raised eyebrows. Oversight of incapacitated adults is often intertwined with court systems, guardianship rulings, placement orders, protective decisions. If there were systemic weaknesses, legislative tightening becomes logical. Reform doesn't necessarily mean something catastrophic happened. Sometimes it means policymakers see vulnerabilities and move preemptively. But the timing, aligned so closely with high-profile protective interventions, makes people wonder. And wondering isn't unreasonable. Public policy rarely emerges in a vacuum. It emerges in context. And the context right now includes state removal of vulnerable adults, ongoing felony proceedings involving individuals tied to the Whittaker orbit, a public scrutiny of family court operations in Raleigh County, a newly introduced bill strengthening neglect definitions. That cluster of events creates questions, not accusations. Questions. Is this reform preventative, reactive, symbolic, substantive? The answer may be a mix of all four. What is certain is this. Senate Bill 54 raises the standard of accountability for caregivers of incapacitated adults in West Virginia. And at this exact moment, the Whittakers are part of that system. To understand why Senate Bill 54 matters, you have to understand one phrase. Gross neglect. That phrase is not casual. It is legal language. And when lawmakers choose to formally define it, they are doing something deliberate. Before this bill, neglect of an incapacitated adult was already illegal in West Virginia. Abuse and neglect statutes existed. Caregivers could be prosecuted under certain circumstances. So what changes? Precision. Senate Bill 54 introduces a clearer definition of gross neglect, specifically identifying reckless or intentional conduct by caregiver that demonstrates disregard for a vulnerable adult's health and safety. That might sound like tightening a sentence, but in law, tightening a definition can change everything, because prosecution depends on thresholds. Without a clear definition, it can be difficult to distinguish between ordinary negligence, poor judgment, systemic understaffing, criminal disregard. When the law specifies reckless or intentional conduct that shows disregard, it sets a measurable bar. Recklessness in legal terms usually means someone knew or should have known that their actions pose a serious risk and ignored it. Intentional means deliberate. That distinction allows prosecutors to move more confidently when facilities or caregivers cross that line. Now place that in context. When vulnerable adults enter state-supervised care, whether in group homes, assisted living facilities, or institutional settings, the assumption is that oversight exists. But oversight systems can fail. Facilities may be underfunded. Staff may be overworked. Training may be inconsistent. Complaints may not be followed through. Legislative strengthening often signals that lawmakers believe enforcement tools need reinforcement. And here's the critical point. Senate Bill 54 does not just target family members in private homes. It applies to caregivers broadly. That includes facility staff. That includes contracted service providers. That includes anyone entrusted with the care of incapacitated adults. So when people say they're in better care now, the law is essentially responding. Better care must be enforceable care. If gross neglect is clearly defined, facilities must operate with that standard in mind. Documentation becomes stricter. Training becomes more urgent. Internal oversight becomes more defensible, because reckless disregard is no longer ambiguous. Now let's connect this to Raleigh County. The Whittaker removals placed 3 incapacitated adults into state care. At nearly the same time, scrutiny of judicial oversight in that county intensified. A family court judge stepped down following conduct violations. That doesn't automatically connect to facilities, but it does create a broader atmosphere of institutional evaluation. When multiple oversight questions surface in one county, involving courts, protective services, and vulnerable adults, legislative reform can feel less like coincidence and more like response. Again, no official statement ties Senate Bill 54 directly to the Whittakers, but policy does not require a press conference explaining its origin story. Public attention changes legislative speed, and the Whittakers brought public attention. Their situation became more than a private family matter. It became a case study in how vulnerable adults move from home care into state systems. Once that transition happens, the public's role changes. You can no longer monitor the porch. You cannot see daily life. You cannot assess quality of care firsthand. You rely entirely on the system. That reliance creates demand for accountability. Now let's examine another layer of this bill. By defining gross neglect clearly, lawmakers reduce ambiguity for prosecutors. Previously, a defense attorney might argue, "This was unfortunate. This was a mistake. This was poor judgment." But if conduct meets the statutory definition of reckless disregard, prosecution becomes more straightforward. That does not mean facilities are guilty by default. It means the line between mistake and criminal liability is clearer. For families with loved ones in care, including those watching the Whittaker situation, that clarity matters. Because once someone is placed indefinitely, the question becomes, who watches the watchers? Senate Bill 54 appears to strengthen that watching. And here's something else to consider. Legislation often emerges after patterns, not necessarily after one case, but after trends. If multiple reports, complaints, or investigative findings indicate systemic weaknesses in how incapacitated adults are protected, lawmakers respond by clarifying standards. The bill was introduced January 14, 2026. That means drafting likely began earlier, possibly months earlier. But momentum can accelerate quickly when visibility increases. And visibility has been high. The Whittakers' removal did not occur quietly. It unfolded under public scrutiny. It intersected with ongoing legal controversies in Raleigh County. It raised questions about guardianship, facility placement, and judicial decision-making. That creates legislative pressure, even if indirectly. Now let's shift focus to impact on individuals like Timmy. Timmy is in his mid-40s. He has significant developmental challenges but has also shown moments of engagement and capability over the years. Some observers believe he could function in semi-autonomous settings with appropriate support. Others believe institutional care is permanent. Whatever the future holds, Senate Bill 54 strengthens the standards governing wherever he resides. If he remains in structured care long-term, the facility must operate under clearer liability. If he transitions to supervised independent living, caregivers remain accountable under the same statute. The law does not determine his path, but it shapes the environment around him. Now, critics might argue, this bill is symbolic. Facilities already had standards. This changes nothing. But statutory clarity matters, because when abuse or neglect cases reach court, defense teams dissect language. Vague statutes create loopholes. Specific statutes create leverage. And leverage protects the vulnerable. The bigger question remains, why now? Why January 2026? Why immediately after months of high-profile protective interventions in the same county? Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's cumulative reform. Maybe it's quiet response to visible controversy. Legislation often operates that way, influenced not by a single headline, but by an accumulation of concern. What's undeniable is this. Senate Bill 54 strengthens criminal accountability for caregivers of incapacitated adults in West Virginia. And right now, 3 members of the Whittaker family are living under that framework. When a bill like Senate Bill 54 appears at the same time a high-profile case is unfolding, people naturally look for a straight line. Event, reaction, reform. But the truth is usually more layered than that. Legislation rarely emerges overnight. Bills are drafted, revised, discussed, and sometimes sit quietly before introduction. So it would be overly simplistic to say that what happened with the Whittakers directly caused Senate Bill 54. However, it would be equally naive to assume public scrutiny plays no role in legislative momentum. Public attention changes urgency, and the Whittaker situation brought urgency. 3 incapacitated adults removed. Placement into state-supervised care. Allegations swirling around oversight. A family court judge in Raleigh County stepping down over conduct violations. Ongoing felony proceedings tied to individuals within the broader orbit. That cluster of events does something powerful. It forces people to look at systems, not just individuals. When systems are examined, lawmakers often respond by tightening statutes. Senate Bill 54 does not name any facility. It does not name any case. It does not reference Raleigh County directly, but it strengthens the legal language around abuse and neglect of incapacitated adults statewide. That suggests recognition that protection mechanisms must be enforceable, not just assumed. Now let's examine how oversight actually works in practice. When incapacitated adults enter state care in West Virginia, several layers of oversight typically apply. Facility licensing requirements, routine inspections, mandatory reporting obligations, our adult protective services involvement, court supervision in guardianship or placement matters. In theory, this creates a safety net. But in reality, safety nets depend on staffing levels, funding, documentation accuracy, whistleblower protections, prosecutorial willingness. If gross neglect was previously loosely defined, that could make prosecution harder. A facility might argue, we were short-staffed. We made a mistake. There was no intent. With clearer statutory language, specifically identifying reckless disregard, prosecutors gain firmer ground. That changes behavior. Facilities respond to liability risk. Training improves when criminal accountability becomes clearer. Internal reporting improves when management understands exposure. Documentation improves when ambiguity shrinks. This is not about assuming wrongdoing. It's about raising the baseline standard. Now let's address the influence question directly. Could the Whittaker case have accelerated legislative attention? It's possible, not because lawmakers were reacting emotionally, but because high-profile cases expose blind spots. When a case draws national attention, reporters start asking questions. Advocates start raising concerns. Community members start contacting representatives. Even if a bill was already in draft form, public pressure can speed its introduction. And timing matters. January 14th, 2026. By then, the removals had already occurred. Legal controversies were already circulating. Scrutiny of Raleigh County's judicial environment was active. That context creates fertile ground for reform. Again, correlation is not proof, but context shapes political climate. Another important point. Senate Bill 54 does not just protect individuals like Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine. It protects every incapacitated adult in West Virginia, which means even if the Whittakers were not the direct catalyst, they may have become symbolic of a larger issue. When people watch the Whittaker story unfold, they didn't just see one family. They saw vulnerability. They saw dependency. They saw how quickly private care can become public care. And when the state assumes responsibility, the standard must be high. Now let's consider a harder possibility. What if Senate Bill 54 reflects awareness that not all institutional care environments are flawless? That doesn't mean corruption is rampant. It doesn't mean facilities are inherently unsafe. But it acknowledges that accountability must exist. Because once someone is placed indefinitely, their ability to advocate for themselves diminishes, especially when they are nonverbal. And that is the most critical factor here. 3 Whittakers are nonverbal or significantly impaired in communication. That makes oversight not just administrative, but moral. They cannot file complaints. They cannot report misconduct easily. They cannot articulate discomfort clearly. The system must anticipate that. Defining gross neglect clearly ensures that reckless disregard cannot hide behind technicalities. Now let's address Raleigh County specifically. The same county that handled the Whittaker removals. The same county whose family court system has faced scrutiny. The same county where a judge recently stepped down over conduct violations. Even if Senate Bill 54 is statewide legislation, the optics are powerful. Reform emerges. Controversy exists. Oversight increases. It sends a message. Institutions are not immune from review. And that's important, because for months, online debates centered on whether the Whittakers were better off in state care. But safety cannot be assumed simply because placement changes. It must be structured. It must be enforceable. It must be reviewable. Senate Bill 54 moves in that direction. Now let's talk about influence in a broader sense. Public pressure doesn't always dictate policy, but it does shape priorities. When a case captures attention, lawmakers become aware that constituents are watching. And when constituents are watching vulnerable populations closely, legislators often move to strengthen protective frameworks. Not necessarily because something catastrophic happened, but because they don't want it to. Prevention is easier than scandal. So the real question may not be, did the Whittakers cause this bill? It may be, did heightened visibility make protective reform politically urgent? That's a different question. And the answer to that is often yes in legislative environments. When a state strengthens protections for incapacitated adults, the impact goes beyond facilities. It reaches into courtrooms, into guardianship proceedings, into placement decisions, into how families interact with state authority. Senate Bill 54 may look like a caregiver accountability statute on the surface, but its ripple effect could extend much further, especially in counties like Raleigh, where protective removals and judicial scrutiny have already drawn attention. Let's start with guardianship. When incapacitated adults cannot make decisions independently, courts often appoint guardians. Those guardians may be family members, state representatives, or court-appointed professionals. Guardianship is powerful. It determines where someone lives, who controls finances, who authorizes medical care, who speaks legally on their behalf. If gross neglect is more clearly defined in statute, guardians themselves operate under clearer liability standards. That means a guardian who recklessly disregards a vulnerable adult's safety could face criminal exposure. That raises the bar. Now apply that to situations like the Whittakers. 3 members of that family were removed and placed under state supervision. Their daily care is no longer managed informally by relatives on a porch in Odd. It is structured, documented, supervised, and now, under Senate Bill 54, potentially scrutinized under a sharper legal definition of neglect. This matters long-term, because placement decisions are rarely temporary in cases involving nonverbal or severely impaired adults. Institutional or supervised living arrangements can last years, sometimes indefinitely. When the state assumes responsibility, legal accountability becomes the backbone of protection. Now let's examine court oversight. Family courts and circuit courts handle many of these placement decisions. They review petitions, approve guardianships, and sometimes reassess care arrangements. If judicial conduct within a county has already faced scrutiny, as Raleigh County recently experienced, legislative reform creates a parallel signal. Oversight must be led, not just courts overseeing caregivers, but statutes reinforcing courts. It builds redundancy into protection, and redundancy is intentional. Because when vulnerable adults cannot advocate for themselves, systems must overlap. Another area impacted is facility compliance culture. Facilities operate differently when criminal liability is clearly defined. Risk managers pay attention. Administrators update policies. Training protocols shift. Documentation becomes more thorough, not because they expect wrongdoing, but because exposure increases. Clear statutory language about reckless disregard forces proactive compliance. That can improve response times to medical needs, reporting of incidents, staff-to-resident ratios, documentation transparency. In theory, Senate Bill 54 strengthens those incentives statewide. Now here's where long-term impact intersects with the Whittakers. Timmy is in his mid-40s. Ray and Lorraine are older. Their futures may involve structured living for years. If so, this bill becomes part of the legal framework governing their daily care. Even if they never directly invoke it, the existence of clearer accountability changes how their caregivers operate. Now let's address something uncomfortable but necessary. When people say they're in better care now, it assumes institutional environments are automatically superior. But no system is immune to failure. Institutional neglect has occurred historically across the country. Group homes have faced investigations. Facilities have closed over misconduct. That doesn't mean all care environments are unsafe, but it means safety requires constant reinforcement. Senate Bill 54 reinforces. It does not guarantee perfection. It increases consequence, and consequence influences behavior. Now let's consider how this could affect transitions. If, for example, Timmy were to move into a semi-autonomous living arrangement, perhaps a supervised apartment or community-supported housing, the caregivers overseeing that environment fall under the same strengthened definition of gross neglect. That creates continuity of protection across settings. Private home to facility, facility to group home to supported living. The statute follows. And that continuity matters, because one of the most fragile points in protective systems is transition. When someone moves from one setting to another, oversight can loosen temporarily. Clear statutory standards reduce that risk. Now zoom out further. Senate Bill 54 also sends a message to families. It signals that neglect, whether reckless or intentional, will be prosecuted. That applies to relatives. It applies to facility staff. It applies to guardians. Equal accountability under law. In politically sensitive cases, that message is important because it counters narratives that systems protect insiders. If enforcement is consistent, trust increases. And trust has been fragile in Raleigh County. Between judicial controversies and high-profile protective removals, confidence in institutional decision-making has been tested. Legislative tightening can restore some of that confidence if enforcement follows, which leads to the final consideration. Laws matter only if enforced. Senate Bill 54 sharpens definitions, but prosecution determines impact. If prosecutors apply the statute consistently, facilities adapt. If enforcement remains rare, the statute becomes symbolic. That's why the next year will be telling. Not just for the Whittakers, for every incapacitated adult in West Virginia. When a high-profile case and a new law appear in the same season, people look for meaning. They look for connection. They look for causation. They look for a headline that ties it together cleanly. But reality is rarely that neat. Senate Bill 54 may not have been written because of the Whittakers. Legislative drafting takes time. Policy discussions often begin long before the public notices them. But visibility changes urgency. And the Whittaker situation brought visibility to one uncomfortable truth. When incapacitated adults move from private care into state systems, the stakes don't disappear, they shift. The promise becomes institutional protection. The risk becomes institutional failure. And that's where this bill matters. By clearly defining gross neglect as reckless or intentional disregard for a vulnerable adult's health and safety, West Virginia lawmakers tighten accountability across the board. Not just for one facility, not just for one county, for the entire state. That's not a small adjustment. It's a signal that vulnerable adults deserve enforceable protection, a signal that oversight must be backed by consequence, a signal that caregivers, whether relatives, guardians, or facility staff, are not beyond scrutiny. Now here's the larger question. When reform follows controversy, is that evidence of weakness or evidence of correction? Some will argue that the timing suggests something went wrong behind the scenes, that public scrutiny exposed cracks in Raleigh County's system, prompting lawmakers to act. Others will argue the opposite, that this is how responsible systems evolve. They identify gaps and reinforce them before larger harm occurs. Both interpretations can coexist. Systems are not static. They adapt. They respond. They strengthen under pressure. The Whittakers became part of that pressure, not necessarily by design, not necessarily by intention, but by circumstance. 3 nonverbal adults entered state care under public attention. That attention made oversight more visible. It made care standards more scrutinized. It made accountability more urgent. And now the law reflects that urgency. For Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine, the long-term impact may not be visible day to day. There won't be headlines every time a staff member documents medication properly. There won't be public updates when a facility updates training. But legal standards shape those quiet routines. They shape how carefully charts are reviewed, how quickly concerns are escalated, how seriously reckless behavior is treated. And for individuals who cannot advocate for themselves, those quiet routines are everything. The broader takeaway is this. Public attention can be disruptive. It can feel invasive. It can fracture narratives. But sometimes it also forces systems to tighten. Whether Senate Bill 54 was directly influenced by the Whittaker case may never be formally stated. But the alignment in timing makes one thing clear. West Virginia lawmakers want to send a message that incapacitated adults are not invisible. Not in homes, not in facilities, not in courtrooms. And that's significant, because for years, the Whittakers lived quietly on a porch in art. Then the world noticed. Then the state intervened. Now the law has shifted. Coincidence? Influence? Systemic correction? Perhaps a combination of all three. What matters most is not the origin story of the bill. It's the enforcement. If Senate Bill 54 strengthens oversight in practice, not just on paper, then vulnerable adults across West Virginia benefit. And in the end, that may be the only part that truly matters. If you've been following these developments, share your thoughts respectfully below. Do you believe public cases like this drive reform? Or was this change inevitable? Either way, the standard has changed. And the future for incapacitated adults in West Virginia will unfold under that sharper definition. Take care. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.